Hello and welcome to a new module of our Exploitation Basics course. In this module, we'll deal with writing exploits for scenarios where we have a limited buffer space. Now, I am working on few assumptions here that you have a prerequisite knowledge of following tools or software, and if you need to learn more about these things or tools, you can check out the resources mentioned at the end of this video. This is our module structure, and we are on the first part, that is introduction, wherein I give you a brief insight into the technique that we will be learning in this module and the tools that are required for this module. So beginning with tools required for this particular module, we'll need a virtualization software. You can use either VirtualBox or VMware, and we'll need two virtual machines, one Linux box and another Windows box. For Linux, I will be using Kali Linux 2018.1 as a VM, and on that I'll need Python 2.7.9 plus, and I'll need a text editor. You can use either Sublime Text or Notepad++ or any other text editor of your choice. And for fuzzing, we'll need BooFuzz on the Linux box. On the Windows box, I'll need a Windows 7 SP1 machine, and on this machine I'm going to install BooFuzz, which is a fuzzing application, and I'll need emulator debugger, Mona library for emulator debugger, and a target application for this software is vulnerableserver.exe, and we'll be needing a text editor. Again, you can use either Sublime Text or Notepad++ or any other text editor of your choice. And finally, we'll be needing Python 2.7.9+. Please note that for this module, any version of Python prior to this will not work with BooFuzz. So I recommend that if you have old versions of Python, please upgrade them to a version which is newer than Python 2.7.9. So let's say you find yourself in a situation wherein you manage to trigger a crash in an application, and you manage to get control of the execution, but you find that you have a very limited buffer space to work with. So how do you get out of that? How do you create more buffer space, or leverage that buffer space to achieve a working shell out of that exploit or out of that crash? Now here, by limited buffer space, I mean that the available buffer space for us is not more than 150 bytes. So 150 bytes, as you would have known by now, is not sufficient for either a TCP bind shell or a reverse shell payload. So we'll have to employ some kind of creativity to get to a shell using this buffer space, using the limited size of a buffer space. Now possible techniques that we can use are: one is egg hunters, wherein you send the egg hunter code, which is usually 32 bytes, as part of your first payload that will be stored in this limited buffer space, and then using some other technique you manage to store a larger payload, let's say a reverse TCP shell, in some other memory region which is not directly accessible to you. But we have already seen this technique, so I'm not going to go into details of it. You can see our previous modules if you want to learn more about this technique. The technique that we will be using in this module is to reuse existing functions. So a lot of times, let's say for example in FTP functions, it happens that most of the functions that we need to run a bind shell or a reverse shell are already loaded as part of the binary. Now what we are going to do is we are going to reuse those functions. Instead of locating them in system, we will be reusing those functions and try to execute our payload. Now there are two types of exploits you can write, again depending on the buffer space that you have. First is a single stage exploit, wherein you require a buffer space of at least 122 bytes for it to run, and using the single stage you can send a reverse shell back to your attacking machine. The second technique, and the technique that we are going to learn in this module, is the multi-stage technique. In this technique, we first send a small payload to the application which executes a function call, and through this function we can then send a larger buffer or a larger payload to the application, which will then get executed and send a shell back to us. A major con of using these techniques is that they are highly OS dependent as they use hard-coded function addresses. So you cannot develop a generic exploit using this technique. If you want to develop a generic exploit, you will have to find a larger buffer space, or you can use the previously mentioned egg hunter technique. Now, if it all sounds a bit complicated, do not worry. I will go into the detail of this technique in later videos, which will help you in developing a better understanding of this technique. So these are the few learning resources you can use to learn more about the tools or techniques that we are using in this particular module. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.